down. Okay.
Super.
That one, second one.
Lovely. Thanks, Charles. Right. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming on a wet and terribly exciting morning, I think, because Algeria is in this situation where we don't know where it's going, along with one or two other countries. And I'm going to stop before 11:30 so you can all rush off to Westminster Square and find out where we are on that one. But it's quite extraordinary. I have never yet said so, but I keep likening Algeria to a little bit like Brexit, in that it really is, I think, totally unpredictable. Maybe some of you have better ideas than me on that. But the thing about Algeria today, right now, is it is facing an unprecedented political crisis and an economic one too. It's extremely complex. I'm going to try and give you a good understanding of it. And I think it's totally unpredictable. If I was being paid to predict what's going to happen, I would just keep sort of, trying to bet on zero, because it is in that sort of state. But we can talk about that towards the end. I think there are one or two scenarios which you can look at, what might happen if and that sort of thing. So this is where we are at the moment. A quick summary of Algeria. Can you hear me okay? Because I'm looking at the screen. Is the voice all right? Okay at the back? Great. Thanks so much. Okay. It's in the grip of I emphasize the word popular and peaceful. We'll talk about that in a moment. Generally known in Arabic as the Hirak, which is a sort of popular process. And I think that's a much nicer word for it. The word popular has sort of bad connotations in terms of sort of Western politics and Western nationalism and so forth. But Hirak is as an Arabic word, and it really does capture, I think, the essence of this movement. It started, I suppose, if we're going to put a historical date on it, 30 or 31 weeks ago, 22nd of February, in massive demonstrations. You've probably seen them every Friday and followed every Tuesday. Tuesday is more the students' demonstration, although they tend to merge. Usually on the Wednesday, the new sort of the country's strongman dictator usually gives a sort of speech, usually on the Wednesday. So there is this sort of weekly ritual of Friday demonstrations, the Tuesday demonstration, and then Qaid Salah, the sort of military dictator, giving his view of events on the Wednesday. And this has been the pattern now for the last few months. The numbers of protesters, very difficult to measure. We're talking about millions. When they've really come out en masse, general consensus right across the media is at least 15 million. Some saying it could be as many as 20. I think there are a few pictures later on to give you some idea of this. If you think of 20 million, which is probably at the top end of the scale, but 15 to 20 million people coming out on peaceful mass demonstrations in a population of only just over 40 million, I think that gives you some feeling of the scale of this sort of protest. For the last 7 months, since February, it's really been a bit of a stalemate between the two sides, if you like, the people, the Hirak, and the regime, whatever you want to call it, the regime or the government for the moment, with a critical point being reached this last week, 15th of September, and I'll come on to what happened on the 15th of December. The Hirak, the people, basically are demanding, and have been, the end of the system, the whole caboodle, so to speak, and they want basically a new system, a new republic, a second republic, one that, if you like, is more democratic, open, fair, etc., etc., etc. Big ask, certainly in a country like Algeria. So far, it has succeeded in removing the last president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was extremely ill man and basically hadn't been doing anything for the previous 5 years or so. We'll come on to that. They've succeeded in basically stopping 2 presidential elections, because they don't want elections under the old system. They want a whole new constitution on the 18th of April and the 4th of July, and there's a third one on the books for the 15th of December, which we'll talk about. The regime at the moment is really controlled, or under the control of Qaid Salah, the Ahmed Qaid Salah. Qaid in Arabic means commander or leader, and it's interesting in the last few weeks that the slogans on the street have changed the name Qaid to traitor, so he's now on the street known as Traitor Salah, not Qaid Salah, but that's the way the public are seeing him. That's Qaid Salah, is demanding presidential elections as soon as possible. We'll explain why later. This is where we are since 15th of September. The acting head of state, Abdelkader Ben Salah, convoked the electorate on the 15th of September, so for the elections. They're now scheduled for the 12th of December. The Hirak and most of the, I won't say all the opposition parties, but in broadly speaking, the Hirak is rejecting the elections. They do not want them. They're going to try and stop them. And I think in advance, I think it'll be unlikely that these elections will take place, but we never know. So the current situation is really the people versus the regime stroke army. We'll talk more about. The questions I'm going to try and address are, why the Hirak? Where did this come from? What was wrong with the Bouteflika system and the regime that they were wanting to replace? What are the people demanding? How has their revolution been organized? What has it achieved so far? What has been the regime's response to it? Why is the regime insisting on forced presidential elections? This is the 15th of December. What is the economic impact of this, of the political crisis on the economy? What will happen and where is Algeria going? And I've just tagged a thing on the end to tell you a little bit more about Qaid Salah, who is probably not the most liked person on the planet. We'll talk about that. So why the Hirak? And the first of those questions, why the Hirak? What was wrong with the Bouteflika reign, 1999, 20 years as president? Basically, in a nutshell, Bouteflika encouraged and set an example for the massive corruption that has become endemic to the country as a whole. Bouteflika and his family were very corrupt himself. He is interesting in that he himself defrauded the state quite heavily when he was foreign minister. He was foreign minister from 1963, but I think the fraud started in 65. Of around the equivalent in monetary equivalent today of about $17 million. He was arrested for that. He was found guilty in Parliament, in the courts. He was later pardoned, and there is no evidence of any repayment. In fact, about a sixth of it might have been, but the evidence is not clear on that. During his era, you'll be familiar with these, he has been associated with these massive corruption scandals, the Khalifa Bank, more or less in chronological order, the BRC Brown Route Condor, Sonatrach scandals, the East-West Motorway, and many, many others. Throughout his era, the elections have become increasingly fraudulent, massively so. I mean, they're completely rigged from top to bottom, and this is one of the huge gripes that, of course, the Algerian people have. Also, his era was particularly well known between 2009 and 2013, because between increasing tension between Mohamed Medien, the DRS, that's the Secret Service, and the presidency. And the army was on the presidency's side. So you had this really serious sort of cleavage in the regime between the presidency on the one side, the Secret Service on the other, led by Medien, and the army supporting the presidency, or the Qaid Salah there. Medien created during that period literally a state within a state. That, I should say, we'll come on to, is now over. In fact, Medien, I heard just now from an Algerian friend here, that Medien was sentenced to 15 years in jail. 1 o'clock this morning the news came through. I was up to date till yesterday afternoon in this trial. It wasn't a proper trial. Anyhow, he's now received 15 years in jail, and he won't get much support, or there'll be no grievance from the public. But we'll come on to that. The turning point, I think, in all these events is really about 2013, 2014. There were three key events here. One was Bouteflika's stroke. The second was the Menas terrorist attack, which most of you, particularly in the oil industry, will be familiar with. And thirdly, the fall in the oil price globally from 1914, sort of end of 14. Okay, first of all, Bouteflika suffered a stroke in April 2013, from which he never recovered. The result of which was that the oligarchs, a very criminal gang, if you like, they're called a gang now by the new regime, Ali Haddad and various others, financed Bouteflika's fourth term as president as 2014. So you have a man who's completely incapable of ruling or governing being put back into power by what has now been called the gang, if you like. And the gang was Said Bouteflika, his younger brother, who also went to prison last night for 15 years, with these oligarchs, plus a very corrupt ruling party, the FLN, and prime ministers in that era, Abdul Malik Selal, Ahmed Uyahya, both also in jail at the moment. They sort of took over the country for the last sort of 5 years. And they effectively, Said Bouteflika was effectively running the country, you might say. He turned the country even more into a mafia state, heavily involved in drugs, real estate, money laundering, and heaven knows what else, on a massive scale. During the Bouteflika era, the revenues from hydrocarbon totaled roughly $1 trillion, 1,000 billion in other words. About 300 billion of that is unaccounted for, and that is what's been moved out of the country, if you like, embezzled by the regime, the close associates at the top of the regime, into the Emirates, France, Switzerland, and elsewhere. And I think the point is one cannot exaggerate the scale of this massive corruption which has continued throughout the Bouteflika regime. The second sort of turning point was really in Menas. This has had huge internal implications within Algeria. Basically, without going into it in detail, you'll probably all remember it, it was a massive attack. It was a false flag terrorist attack which went disastrously wrong. And the army, that's Qaid Salah, had evidence of the DRS's involvement in arming those so-called terrorists and behind it. This led to a shift in the balance of power. The presidents in the army basically been able to get rid of Medien and the DRS, which has been now reconstructed even more strongly under Qaid Salah. But it got rid of Medien at that time. And at that time, the various departments of the DRS were split between the presidency and the army. But in last year, really the army under Qaid Salah took over pretty well everything. The entire intelligence security services, which are massive, by the way, and strengthened the powers of the army. So you could argue now that Qaid Salah and the army is even stronger than Medien was, when he was more or less running the country. And the army now has power of judicial police, so it can go around arresting people and all the rest of it. So it's a pretty frightening situation. So by the end of 2018, the Army Chief of Staff, Qaid Salah, had become the country's strong man. And the pictures underneath there are Tatag, who took over as head of the DRS after Medien, the Medien himself in the middle there, and Said Bouteflika there. They were all sentenced last night to 15 years jail. We'll come on to that. So I only heard the sentencing last night because the court case was only starting really yesterday, and all four of them, as a fourth one, weren't prepared to talk. So I don't quite know what's happened, but between being prepared to talk in the afternoon and sometime later on, the judge said, right, you're all guilty, 15 years, which is a nice sort of fair open trial, which we're familiar with. Finally, the third big impact on the country at that time was the fall in the oil price. And this has triggered, really, a deepening economic crisis, which has just got progressively more serious since 2014. And the reason why it's so serious is that 97% of export earnings at that time were from hydrocarbons. It was a full rentier economy and totally dependent on that. The crisis has got so bad at the end of 2017, Prime Minister Uyahya decided just to print money. They printed about $30 billion equivalent, which has had no impact on anything at all. The reason for that is that it's mostly gone into the regime. They've just taken it out of the country, and it's sitting around in private bank accounts in Dubai, France, Switzerland, and elsewhere. Interestingly enough, it hasn't had any inflationary effect yet. And I won't go into the details of that, but it's kind of interesting, but when you think about it, there are quite simple reasons for it. It may well have inflationary effects later on, but not yet. One of the impacts of this economic crisis is that the regime is no longer able to treat unrest as it normally has done, which is just to buy it off. It hasn't got the money to literally buy off the protesters in terms of increasing salaries, increasing subsidies or whatever else. It just doesn't have the money to do that. So its traditional method of buying off unrest is no longer really open to it, and that could become quite interesting in the next few months and next year. The foreign exchange reserves, which were substantial, the envy of countries like England and most other Western countries, were about $200 billion at the end of 2014. The country's been sort of drawing down on those more progressively. At the end of this year, they'll be around about 60 billion and dropping down at about 20 billion a year. So there's still a little bit there. There is a question, of course, of how accessible those reserves are and so forth, which is a bit of an unknown question. The other thing is that import curbs of trying to cut the import bill have just not worked. They're still roughly at the same sort of level, about $40 billion a year, because more or less everything is imported because it's a rentier economy. And this has been causing increasingly more serious structural economic problems in the country as a whole. All of these economic problems are just piling up, and I think next year will be extremely difficult for the country. And they're being exacerbated, for reasons we'll come on to later, by the political crisis. So what have the people been demanding, the Hirak? Basically, they want the end of the old, corrupt, dictatorial system, which is run by a regime of a political, military, business elite that probably numbers no more than about 10,000 people, including wives and family. It's not a large number of people. It wants to change Algeria to some sort of democratic. The word democracy is always a bit difficult these days. A democratic Algeria in which all the symbols of the old regime are removed and replaced by a truly sort of democratic system. How one reaches that, of course, is another matter, but some sort of democratic system that is based on the rule of law. And in other words, a new republic or a second republic, to get rid of the whole system that has existed really since independence in 1962. To understand this, it's helpful, I think, in the next few slides, just to run through the key events of what's happened in the last 7-8 months, just to give you a sort of chronological understanding of how we've got from around February, March to today. And to give you some idea of, you can't count 20 billion people here, but these are the sort of scenes you get every Friday and Tuesday in most cities in the country, at least for it is massive. It is massive. And if you think of just the human effort, particularly when you've got police down there making life very awkward and arresting people and being difficult, this is a huge popular movement. And I think that picture, of which there are hundreds on the press, is just one of many that indicate what it's like. Okay, so just to run through really the events of this year so we can understand where we've got to. The opposition to a Bouteflika fifth term. Bouteflika's fourth term, which, he was, I won't use the word cabbage, but it was horribly insulting, but he was completely unable to rule the country because of his stroke, came to an end in sort of April of this year. So the question was, would he stand for a fifth term or resign? And the whole regime around him were pushing for a fifth term because for them this is very convenient. This gang was running the country, corruption was just running rife. So to have, a president, a non-existent president, there was extremely useful for the gang, if you like. So there was a lot of pressure, a huge build-up of pressure in the country through December, January, February about whether this fifth term would actually come to pass. And the election date was set for 18th of April, and this was provoking massive popular opposition, which broke out after the 10th of February when the Bouteflika camp announced that he would be standing. That was a sort of key date. Yes, he will stand for a fifth term, greeted with massive anger, and the first Hirak demonstrations were the Friday after that, when people just came out on the streets, literally in their millions. And the pressure has escalated literally every Friday, every Tuesday. People on the Friday, students on the Tuesday, but they're mixed. By middle of March, some of these were absolutely enormous. This figure of 15 to 20 million people I've mentioned. Calling for the end of the Bouteflika regime, the system, and for a second republic, a new start. On the 2nd of April, Bouteflika or his gang threw in the towel and he resigned. But just before he did so, he installed a new sort of puppet government, Prime Minister Badawi, before he went. That's significant because in constitutional terms, this present government, who the people want out, technically does have legitimacy legally in that it was appointed by a president while he was still president, a couple of days before. We'll come back to Badawi later. Okay, what are the people demanding? Sorry, these are running. Sorry, these are continuations of the chronology. The headings there. Okay, so we get sort of after March, February, March, Qaid Salah beginning to consolidate the DRS, now called the DSS, but the same, the secret services under him. Tartag was dismissed. He was the replacement for Medien. The Hirak, the people are demanding the sort of cries from the street for the first few weeks and months were to get rid of the three Bs. Ben Salah, who was the acting head of state, standing in for Bouteflika, Tayyip Belaiz, the head of the Constitutional Council, another part of the institutional power around Bouteflika, and Badawi, the Prime Minister. Badawi was the Minister of the Interior under Bouteflika. His speciality was electoral fraud, actually. Fraud in Algeria is massive. Badawi, as Minister of the Interior, ran this in quite an incredibly efficient way. Actually, it was just ridiculously how you get these massive false figures in the elections. But Badawi was in charge of the Interior Ministry, a nasty bit of work, really. So those are the three Bs which the Hirak were demanding to go. Belaiz resigned fairly quickly in mid-April, and Qaid Salah took an interesting tactic at this point of starting to arrest large numbers, what he calls the gang, all those associated with Bouteflika, businessmen, state officials. We're talking about dozens, hundreds of senior people being arrested on corruption charges or being forced to resign, such as, for example, Sonatrach's CEO, Ul Qadur, who some of you will know in the oil industry. This was really not to get rid of corruption, because probably the most corrupt person in Algeria is Qaid Salah himself. We'll talk about his practices and so forth. So all those belonging to the Bouteflika regime around him were being literally banged up and pre-trial detention put in Al Harash prison and in the military prisons and so forth on corruption charges. This was really to sort of pacify the people. I'm giving you a clean republic. It didn't really wash. People obviously took great pleasure in seeing all these people whom they detested being taken into the prisons and so forth, and hearing the news last night. So this was not, the people were certainly liked the look of all this, but it didn't wash with them. They realised what was going on. They realised this was just Qaid Salah trying to appease them, if you like, and offer them this. So it hasn't really. The people would like to see all these people locked up. They would also like it to be done in an open, proper legal framework, not these sort of trumped-up kangaroo court trials like last night when we've no idea what happened there. So we're getting this a large number, hundreds of senior officials being just locked up. This will come on to us having a huge impact on the economy, by the way. At this time, March, April, the army through Qaid Salah, was giving the impression verbally that it was sort of supportive of the people. The army will stand by the people, this sort of statement. That's gone for the birds now, we'll come on to that. And again, on the 4th of May, this gang, these were the ones who were jailed last night. I just heard this morning. So Saïd Bouteflika, Medien, Tartag, Selal and Ouyaki are still in prison, along with these oligarchs, Kounin, Haddad, and all the rest of it. So they're either in prison, they're in prison in one way or another, this is the point. By mid-May, you get Qaid Salah, the tone of his speeches begins to sort of shift a little bit. His support for the people is becoming a bit more hardline, and you can see, certainly in his speech, in the language he's using, things beginning to change there. Then we get to the 4th of July election. This is the postponed general election, and this is cancelled because of pressure from the Hirak. Basically, no people were prepared to stand as a candidate because of the vilification and pressure they were getting from the street. So we get the second election being cancelled, and the third one is now coming up. At this time, you begin to get Ben Salah and a few other people beginning to talk about dialogue, and one senses that, you know, the extreme positions here, there may be a middle way, a moderate way, some sort of dialogue might start emerging. And that's been extremely complex over the last few months. I won't go into the details. Needless to say, that has come to a rapid, sudden halt, you know, as of last week. So all this talk about dialogue, for the moment anyhow, has been thrown out. But we get this coming onto the agenda. By July, we're getting quite clear splits within the opposition parties. The broad gist of these splits, or big split really, is one which is saying, okay, we can compromise with the regime, you know, something towards a more middle way, maybe a sort of dialogue way. So you begin groups of opposition parties, you know, small in number, but in that side, against a more numerous, and the majority of them, taking a line, no, we want the clean revolution, we want the whole gamut. You know, so you've got, if you like, about 7 of the opposition parties, who are small in number, I should say, lining up more with the sort of Hirak against other members of the opposition who are taking a more moderate view, ready to compromise and so forth. In amongst that lot, I'd chuck in Ali Ben Fleece, whose name will pop up a bit more. Some of you may know Ali Ben Fleece. He would be typical of those on that side. The army and the police are beginning now to take more political prisoners. Bear in mind that the demonstrations have been extremely peaceful, but we're beginning to get now, and I'll explain this a bit more why, a bit more action from the regime in terms of just arresting people and taking political prisoners. The anti-corruption campaign really sort of gears up into you know, I was running in a weekly sort of who had been taken in that week, and I stopped doing it because the numbers were just getting crazy and moving down to officials that people wouldn't know about. But the whole gearing up of the anti-corruption campaign through the midsummer is there. And this time you're getting Qaid Salah now coming out even more strongly in hard-nosed terms, basically saying that dialogue's out of the question, really. All the preconditions that are being asked for by those ready to compromise, okay, free the political prisoners, get the police off our backs, open up the press, which has been clamped down on, etc., etc. These are sort of preconditions, people saying, you know, until that's done, some sort of appeasement from the government, you know, we can't really have dialogue. Qaid Salah is now saying, no preconditions, had enough of it, I'm not freeing political prisoners, you know, complete sort of denial, no, no, no. And he's now saying that the Hirak's demands have been met in any case. You know, they wanted Bouteflika chucked out, they've succeeded on that. So now all we've got are sort of troublemakers, enemies of the state, traitors, etc., evil people. I mean, his language has reached quite sort of superb, you know, exaggerations. So we're now seeing Qaid Salah beginning to take a very hard line against the people. By late August, and I'll come back to his motives in a moment, by late August, a few weeks ago, it's quite clear that the Hirak has survived the summer. Basically, Qaid Salah's strategy, which I'll come on to, was to try and break this movement through the summer months, and we'll say how in a minute. But by late August, so 4 weeks ago, it was clear that it had survived. It was refreshing itself. It was re-energizing the beginning of the year, September. People come back to school, university, back to work from hot summer holidays. And with the start of the social year, we see Qaid Salah increasing repression from early September, late August onwards, so 4 weeks ago. By now, the Hirak is reinvigorated. It's clearly refusing to buckle, as the regime had hoped. Numbers are building up again in the demonstrations after the difficult summer months. Qaid Salah is now calling them enemies of the state, traitors, etc., and is insisting on an urgent, an immediate election, reasons for which I'll explain in a moment. So how has the Hirak been organised? This is a very problematic issue. It relies very much communicating through the social media, okay, which is well and truly infiltrated, of course, by the regime. So you're getting a battle going on in the social media. It has no structured leadership. It's very much a people's movement. There are no names attached to it. There's no committee at the top. There are no obvious names and leaders, well, there are a few emerging there. There's no one, and the problem is there's no one if you wanted to negotiate with the Hirak, who do you negotiate with? There is no sort of structure to it. In terms of negotiation, I've just added here, we know now that the regime never intended any dialogue anyhow, which maybe most of the Hirak probably knew at the time or suspected. So no names, no leaders. The reason for this is very clever. Algerian people know this regime very well. They've suffered it since 1962, and they've suffered it particularly over the Bouteflika years. They know what will happen. If the regime gets hold of a name, that person will be taken out, arrested, killed, intimidated, and so forth. That's been happening a bit more in the last few weeks. So they know full well that if they had elected any sort of committee or structures that they could represent, that they would be taken out in one way or another, as has been happening. So their demands, if you like, their messages are coming out very much on banners and slogans every Friday and Tuesday, and these are pretty consistent, same message all the time. We're not giving up, we're here to stay, etc., etc. And through opposition by the civil society movements. Again, the message is coming out from the Hirak through these other organisations, opposition parties, civil society movements, whose members, of course, are in the crowd, they're in the Hirak, but in a sense, the message is coming out more from those areas. So an amorphous, if you like, interesting organisation structurally. In revolutionary terms, this is quite novel, organisation. It's something that's difficult for the regime. It didn't know really how to handle it to begin with. It's still not really sure, but it's there. What has it achieved so far? Well, you might say not very much. It's the resignation of Bouteflika, the resignation of Belaïs, not quite so important. They've had 2 elections cancelled. Unlike the regime, it has demonstrated an extraordinary maturity and an extraordinary responsibility. I mean, after these massive demonstrations, they have squads going around cleaning up the street. I mean, can you believe it? They have a demonstration, then they have their own people literally picking up the litter in the streets. I mean, it's this sort of responsibility and not being provoked. And it's led to quite a few people, I think in some seriousness, actually talking about the Nobel Peace Prize being given to the Algerian Hirak. And I, for one, would certainly understand, the reasoning behind that. But the point is, the regime is still in place. It's still very much ruling the roost, and the political stalemate is there in spite of all that. What has been the response of the regime through the summer? Well, Qaid Saleh's strategy has been to try and break the Hirak through the summer season, particularly through Ramadan, May and June, and then through the hot summer months, which are always very difficult in Algeria, power shortages and so forth, very difficult for people, very stressful. And he was reckoning that he could probably break it through these difficult months. People are away from work, they're divided up, they've gone home and all the rest of it. The tactics he's used, this Zouavism was very interesting. Zouavist, you may remember, came to fore in the Algerian rebellion. These were auxiliaries attached to the French army. So Arab auxiliaries attached, and it was a command named as the Zouavists. So Zouavism is basically accusing people of being collaborators with colonialists, troublemakers, outsiders, foreigners, and so forth. And what was happening here is the regime was getting into all the social media sites, placing up false messages that so-and-so did this, giving complete false histories of their collaboration with the French or whatever else and so forth, and bringing this right down even to family affairs, that so-and-so's having an affair here, illicit affairs, trying to break up families, pretty disgusting sort of stuff. So this whole Zouavist strategy was pretty high-powered and really quite nasty, being fought out in the social media through the early summer. Threatening people, particularly through loss of jobs, loss of accommodation, most accommodation is state-controlled and so forth, basically saying if we see you out on the street again, you'll lose your jobs and so on and so forth. Also trying to divide the country up in a very nasty, very dangerous way of trying to split so-called Berbers and Arabs, which is a very dangerous thing to do because by and large they are fairly well integrated, but you can certainly start driving a cart and horses through them if you try hard enough. And again, trying to single out Berbers who are mostly concentrated in the Kabylia areas, wilayas of Tizi Ouzou and Béjaïa and these sort of areas, and smearing them and so forth, and trying to divide the country on a racist line. Fortunately, that pretty much backfired, in that certainly most of the Berber, the Amazigh population weren't prepared to stand for this, and they said, no, we're all Algerians, we're united, and so on and so forth. Fortunately, not so many on the Arab side also really went for it, and it's very difficult to start distinguishing between Arab and Berber in Algeria. So I won't say it's a false dichotomy, it's not, but it's very much integrated, particularly when you think some of the worst offenders of the regime, Median and these people who are in fact Berbers, so it gets a bit messy when you start looking at who's who in sort of racist or ethnic terms. But this was the strategy there, banning the Amazigh flag, for which there's no law against that, by the way, in Algeria, and then arresting people who are carrying the flag, and they're still in jail at the moment. So by late August, after all this sort of strategy against the Hirak, as we said, it was still strong and getting stronger as people come back from holiday, go to school and so forth. So the last 2 or 3 weeks have seen a huge reinvigoration, if you like, of the numbers. In September, when Qaid Salah realized this is happening, he issues an order, totally illegal, by the way, in terms of legal law and constitution, to stop vehicles entering Algeria. Anyone found carrying people into Algeria, they can be blocked, the vehicles taken, buses or anything else, and the drivers, the owners, fined, which is quite a strong measure, and it stops, makes people think twice. If you've got one bus and that's your business, and you're going to lose it or be fined. So again, this has also not really worked. Numbers are increasing in spite of this sort of fairly Dracula measure, increasing intimidation and arrests of people. So far, people are resisting this, but the next few months will be critical. Dialogue, which I said never really got started, but that's zap. Whatever ideas there were on that front have been stopped, and that gets quite complicated in who was involved. I won't go into details there. And increasing more and more quite nasty propaganda against the Hirak, using much stronger language, enemies of the state, traitors, whatever else you can think of. The picture, by the way, was Qaid Salah. Why does the regime insist on calling this election? Well, basically, it fears that any sort of democratic transition would end up with the system being thrown out and the regime with it. And this is really problematic for people like Qaid Salah and a lot of those still around him. They are all even bigger criminals in many respects than those they've got locked up in terms of corruption and so forth. So if they were to concede in any sort of way, they too would find themselves in a proper court of law, not a kangaroo trial, having to face questions about literally, in Qaid Salah's case, probably at least 100 million, maybe more, being filched out of the country and so forth. So in a sense, some of those members still around Qaid Salah, for them to concede is really possibly the kiss of death for them in terms of any retribution that may come later. And a new constitution, of course, would prevent the current system re-emerging. Through an election, under the existing rules, the regime thinks it can probably control it and basically more or less get back into power, keep the present system going without a great deal of change. It may resort to more violence. This is a tricky one. It's determined to sort of squash all opposition before December. I don't think it will. There is this perpetual threat of bringing in more violence against people. This is a very dangerous strategy because probably if it got to using the troops, they would almost certainly side with the people. So you would have a mutiny at some level, probably even before it got to that stage. But I can't imagine Algerian troops who are terribly badly treated in the barracks, the lower ranks of the army, turning against their people. So increasing violence is a dangerous strategy from the regime's point of view. An excessive violence, it could lead to a push against Qaid Salah from within the army, which may be a good solution, I think, actually. So here we are, presidential election for 12th of December. The regime thinks it can control it with their candidate, more electoral fraud. They'll make a few concessions, but fundamentally the institutional structures of the ruling elites and their control over the country would remain. That's how the regime is probably seeing it. The Hirak, most of the opposition, know all this, and they are resisting an election. They are determined to stop it. If I had to put money on it, I think it will be unlikely that they will have an election. It's going to be extremely difficult. If they do have it, it'll be very nasty and possibly very dangerous. Impact on the economy. Okay. Basically, there's no clear decision-making at the top of the country. Nothing is happening. I mean, just take Sonatrach. No one, there's no decision-making, no discussions with foreign investors and so forth. Everything is like paralyzed because of this. And foreign investment staying away until the future is clearer, not surprisingly. Sonatrach, for example, has been replaced, but it's more or less paralyzed. The president ministers are more or less incompetent anyhow. They just put there. They also can't really get out of their offices, because when they do try and venture into the countryside, the mob gets them, and they have to be sort of massively secured by police and put back on the plane or the bus and rushed out of town again. So they've more or less realized they can't get out to the people and communicate with them because of popular anger against them. More interesting or important from the economy, most of the bosses, of course, are in prison. With the result, these huge state companies taken over by the oligarch sector, salaries aren't being paid, plant closures, some of them are being put into so-called administration. Very difficult to know the numbers here, but some talks of at least 30,000 businesses have been temporarily closed down or put out of business. So maybe at least 200,000 people laid off, possibly more. Very difficult to get figures because the media itself is being pressurized, intimidated by the regime. So it's difficult getting any accurate sort of figures. It could be much worse than this. Okay, we've got the budget, the Loi de Finances, coming up right now. There's going to be a huge budget deficit next year, not unexpected, but problems are going to be, the economic crisis is getting bigger. They're talking about external borrowing. They're denying they'll continue to print money, but they probably will have to. And the increased economic hardship, which is inevitable under this situation, is likely to lead to more social unrest. There's a lot of signs of this already building up around the country. So, okay, where do we go from here? What will happen? We're in this situation. We're now really a major confrontation between the regime, Qaid Saleh and the army, versus the Hirak. There's talk and threats of civil disobedience, rolling strikes, whatever that may mean. Civil disobedience is always a bit of a messy term, a little bit dangerous because it could open up the Hirak to violence from the government. The government could use that as a pretext, so it's not a simple matter. So that's a bit of an unknown quality, a factor there. They do face the reality, the Hirak, of increased repression and probably violence over the next couple of months. But again, increasing violence could be tricky, particularly if within the security forces themselves they're not sort of happy with this. His view, Qaid Saleh, is to increase pre-election repression. He wants to sort of smash the Hirak so that the opposition to the election is minimized. That is just not going to happen. People are just not going to buckle in that sort of way, I don't think. If the election goes ahead, a big if, people won't vote. Okay, they'll falsify the election results as they have done and come out with fudged figures and so forth. Will there be any candidates? Well, Ali Benfis, who I won't say much about other than he's an opportunist of the extreme order, is already making it pretty clear he's prepared to stand. And the people will reject him lock, stock and barrel, even though in the West he's a bit of a darling because he's seen as a moderate and stood against Bouteflika and all this sort of stuff, but he's part of the regime, and I don't think Algerians will go much that way. The election will be rigged if it goes ahead as usual. The new president, if he's formed, of course, will be completely illegitimate. So in a sense, you're back to square one. The crisis will just deepen. Will it get that far? I believe, I hope this is that the younger officers, colonels, sort of downwards perhaps, may intervene. If the crisis really gets to the point where, something horrific is going to happen, and which is, it's heading that way, we may get an intervention from within the army which would be extremely popular, I think, amongst most Algerians, to sort of get rid of Qaid Salah and those around him. But that is maybe still a little bit of wishful thinking. A little bit about Qaid Salah, just to... he's officially 79. Most people reckon he's old. He fabricated his documents, maybe 84. His great claim to fame in his little world, or big world, is that he's the only Algerian officer who's ever actually had a fight, fought anyone, apart from fighting his own people, you know. And that was the battle, if you can call it a battle of Amgala against the Moroccans in 1976, which I don't think was such a great sort of effort on the Algerians' part. They finished up with about 100 troops being taken prisoner and having to negotiate their release a couple of days later. So I don't think it was the great sort of military expedition that Qaid Salah might like to imagine it was. And it's a bit faded into history. Most people have to remember it's the name of the place even. It's down in Western Sahara now. He was dismissed in the 1980s for his homosexual activities. I won't go into those. They're just coming back to light again in the public media, but with not much effect so far. And of course, in a Muslim country, this is very difficult. He replaced Benazir as deputy minister, this unprecedented, he's head of the army, and he's effectively minister of defence, which is a very powerful position. Benazir couldn't stand the sight of the man, and that sort of made him resign, one of the reasons why. He is massively corrupt. The so-called Annaba clan, I won't get into all the details with the Emirates. Down in the south, Tamanrasset, he is running huge corruption schemes. He's got a gold mine there, illegal. Only this month it transferred 3 tons of gold to the Emirates. He runs it through the army security. He's registered in his son's name. He's also been building a road from literally nowhere to nowhere, budget about $2.8 billion equivalent. Which I think has been more or less stopped, but that will be filching more money out of the army into his great buddy Bahadine Kleber up in Annaba, very messy. And he's also been taking money from so-called terrorists coming back from the south, which aren't terrorists, where they get a 35,000 euro repentance allowance. And these are basically his own smugglers. They're running them through, he's pocketing the money, and so it's really messy. So what's going on in the south is pretty horrific. Very few people know about this. But it's interesting, when he gives his speeches, you might say, well, why is he always down in the south? Tamanrasset Janet. Well, he's got all his rather mucky corruption businesses down there, so that's the reason why. So this is all about him. Massive crime used in Mauritania. President elections. There's always been this analogy with Algeria's Egypt's Sisi. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Interesting enough, he was always loyal to Abdelaziz Bouteflika, but hated his brother. And one reason for this is that when he took over as head of the army in 2004, he was about 5th in command, maybe lower. Why was he over-promoted? And the reason for that was because the DRS, the Secret Services, knew about his sexual proclivities, they knew about his corruption, therefore they could blackmail him, they had him over a barrel. So you get probably one of the nastiest guys in Algeria being over-promoted, largely because the Secret Services could, control him. So that sort of explains why he sort of came to power there. If there is an escalation of violence or the election is aborted, this is where we are now. The main hope is possibly the army steps in. The people still have this funny veneration for the army as an institution. The fact that it has let them down time and time again is neither here, but the army is the state. There is this joke, Algeria is an army with a big patch of land to run around in. So the people still accept the army, not the generals and Qaid Salah. So there is possibly, and I think maybe the best solution might be for the army to step in there, but I wouldn't want to predict anything. I think this is a bit like Brexit today. Where does Algeria go from here? I think it's an extremely, potentially dangerous situation, extremely complicated. I've just skimmed through it, really. There's an awful lot at stake. Algeria is a massively powerful country. It's the biggest country in Africa, 10th biggest hydrocarbons producer in the world. It has probably the greatest economy, totally unexploited economy in the world, if you just think of tourism alone, which is minimal because a lot of the regime doesn't like it. Think of Spain with 35 odd million tourists a year. Algeria has much more to offer than Spain in terms of sea, coast, climates and everything else, and it gets nothing. So the potential for Algeria is massive. It also has to restructure the economy. So for those of you interested in investment and looking ahead, this is one of the great, untapped potential bonanzas somewhere in the future, heaven knows where. So in a sense, it's crucial to keep an eye on Algeria, what's happening. Where is it moving to? And it's moving literally day by day by day. I only heard this morning that those 4 were sentenced at 1 o'clock last night. So we're dealing with an immensely important country. It is the pivot of the Mediterranean. It is right up, be careful with my language here, very close to France in the most dubious manners in many respects, plus the UAE, plus Russia. It's got 40 odd million people there, many of whom could find themselves coming over to France. So this is Europe's real doorstep. We talk about Libya. Algeria is the place to watch, because what happens here will have a huge impact on all of these sort of ramifying areas. And the only advice I can give you, I'm not really selling Menas at all, is follow what we write and say. We follow it literally daily and weekly, at least give you which way the pulse is moving over the last week or so. And it is literally shifting day by day. You get a bit more of an inkling of where things might go or might happen. But I'm going to stop there. I've spoken far too long. And there are people in the audience who know much more than I do. I know that for starters, and there are a few questions already starting from the back.
Jeremy, thank you.